don't want to take too much time from our speaker, Peter Yenne, but I do want to make a few introductory remarks. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos al museo, saludos a todos. We're so happy you're here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art for the opening of Qosqo, Entre el Pasado y el Presente, Photography in Cusco, 1895 to 1945. I think you're in for a real treat this afternoon. This exhibition is the first of its kind in the United States to focus on 9 photographers active in Cusco during the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I've wanted to work with this material ever since I saw our speaker today installing some of these photographs at the Hallie Ford Museum of Art at Willamette University in 1992. So that's how long it's been since some of these images were here in Oregon. Thank you, Peter, for bringing that show then. My partner, Joel Weinstein, and I were just captivated by the images, the lives of the photographers, the material, and we both wrote about the show, and we're just fans ever since then. So that's how long I've wanted to realize this exhibition, and I can't think of a better place and institution to have it be and share it with the public. Peter just brought all of this to life with his knowledge and humor and lively stories, so very excited to hear from you this afternoon. Thank you for being here with your family, with Julian. I've, had the tremendous pleasure to work with staff here. Everybody at the JSMA works on these exhibitions, from Kurt and Carrie and Lisa working on the finances, an amazing staff that installs the show, Joey, Mark, Daryl, and Anthony, and also my colleagues, who gave me the green light when I first got the job here. I said I really would like to present this material, and Jill Hartz, the executive director, gave it a thumbs up with the other curators. So that initial support was really important. Also, Mike Bragg, who did all the graphics and design, he also put together this booklet which has biographical information in Spanish and English on all the photographers and some other historical background context on things. And Debbie worked on marketing. Also, Kristen Newell put together this great iPad, which is at the end of that wall there, so you can zoom in on images and see things that might not, be evident to the naked eye when you're standing in front of these photographs. So check that out as well. Take your picture in front of this spectacular period backdrop. If you need a chair to sit during the talk, grab a chair over here. We're going to make kind of a circuit around the room. So we'll start opposite of me and slowly work our way over here. I want to thank 3 professors at University of Oregon who helped me do the very difficult job of selecting which images to show here. We had a lot of material to choose from, but we selected images that would work well with curriculum and teaching needs on campus. So those 3 individuals were Gabriela Martinez in the School of Journalism, Myra Botaro here from the Department of Romance Languages, and also Carlos Aguirre in the Department of History. And, okay, of course, our deep thanks to the two curators of the exhibition, Peter Yenne from Houston, Texas, and he worked with Adelma, Benavente, García, who lives in Arequipa. So they were a pretty dynamic duo all these years to bring this work together for us to enjoy. And they did a lot of research in the last couple of years, so which added to titles, dates, attributions, biographical information. So thank you for all of that work that you did. I also, so Peter and Adelma, they're the founders of the Photographic Archive Project. And I also want to acknowledge two other collaborators with them, Michelle Penhall and all the Earthwatch volunteers who worked many years on bringing this material to light. So the lenders to the show are Adelma, Benavente, Garcia, Peter Yenne, the Archivo Fototeca Andina, and also the Archivo Figueroa Yabar. So we're deeply grateful to the lenders to the show, and we have just a real special treat today to have the grandson of one of the photographers with us, Aníbal Pepper Figueroa, and his wife, Ann Pepper. And Aníbal is the grandson of this photographer on this wall, Juan Manuel Figueroa Aznar. So we'll hear a few words from him at the end, too. I just also want to make one mention that for 30 years, I mean, I just have to acknowledge these things, you know. I just find the material as fresh and exciting as I did in 1992. I hope you do as well. And for 30 years, Peter and Adelma have developed relationships with people to have access to these archives, to catalog and document and scan and print and publish and exhibit this work. And I just want to acknowledge your tremendous contributions to the field. We're very grateful to you. Peter is a photographer, a curator, and a photo historian, and thank you for your friendship and trust. Please join me in welcoming Peter Yenne.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to see a crowd. I always wonder who's going to be interested in this material. And, you know, of course, I'm locked away in my room for years and years. And I know it's interesting, but I don't expect other people to think so necessarily. So it's good that you do. And I do want to just very quickly thank everybody here, the staff, all the people that Cheryl has just mentioned, because they've done a fantastic job. And they've made it possible to do something that I've been wanting to do for, let's see, when was the last show we did? 2004. So this is, what, 15 years that I've been waiting for the third act of this project that we've been engaged in for 30 years. And what we did was we went and we digitized collections of old photographs in Peru and Bolivia. And we had a team of Earthwatch volunteers. In the end, it was maybe 120 volunteers over the course of 3 summers who came down and worked with us in sort of what you might think of as a very high altitude Kinkos, scanning. And so that work has taken a long time to come to fruition, and we're not done with it yet. But this was the most difficult, the most complicated of all the shows to do, because it has so many photographers. And they span half a century. Their interests were very different, their techniques were different, and in almost every case, the selection of images that we have from these photographers is very limited. And it's disparate. I mean, it would have been, you know, they would have been disparate had it not been so limited. But given that we have almost a random selection in many cases, fortunately not so much with the Figueroa material and a few of the other photographers, but as a result, you really, conceptually, when you try to put this together and make some kind of sense of it, it's hard. If you're working with a single archive that runs for 30 years, it's not so hard. You have probably one artistic personality, maybe two, and they work in the same place, they cover similar themes, and then you can just sort of work through it chronologically or thematically, and it's pretty straightforward. As an intellectual project, it's not that hard. But this is. So the way this, it's hard to hang, and we went back and forth many times. Cheryl was very patient, and she said, what do you think of this? I said, well, it's almost right, but she stuck with me, and the staff, as I said, have done a fantastic job of installation. It looks great. I would have loved to have twice as many pictures, because that's what was my dream selection, but we'll make do with what we have today. And as I say, we work our way through, we're going to have to sort of hopscotch through different themes, but that's the nature of the show. And at the end, I hope that, if nothing else, you can see that these photographers chronicled a culture in transition, and a very fascinating and a complicated culture that goes back thousands of years, and a colony that was around for 400 years before, it was one of the viceroyalties, along with Mexico and Argentina, and during the colonial days. So this was Lima and Peru were an essential part of the Spanish Empire, and a huge, of course, cash cow for the colonies. So it's had a very rich culture on the coast, with the colonial culture, but then on top of that you have thousands of years of indigenous culture. And trying to get those two cultures to mesh has been the Peruvian national project since the conquest, and it's still a work in progress. So these pictures reflect, to some extent, that sort of national project, if you will, or at least different stages in that. We can start over here, and this photograph by Luis de Gismondi shows one of the most iconic tourist sites in Cusco. This wall is still there, exactly the same. It's been that way since 1380, something like that. As you can see, those rocks are not going anywhere. But this exact pose with an indigenous figure is still used in postcards today. So they were inventing, in some ways, in their own way, with their own material, the tourist postcard and an image of the tourist attraction that Peru is today. And the wall of this palace, this is the bishop's palace in Cusco, and this is one wall. But at the end of the show here, we'll talk about the Grand Salon that's inside this building in the colonial part that was built on top of an Inca palace. And so you will see sort of how the colony and the church replaced the Inca royal families and the Inca religion. These gentlemen here are local village headmen. And by looking at one of the things that, as you look through these pictures, what people wear tells you a tremendous amount about who they are and what they see their role is in the culture. And this is a regional authority. These men are sort of his sub-prefects, if you will. Each of these men is a headman in his village. And these staffs that they carry are covered in silver, and that's their badge of office. And that staff, the vara, goes back to colonial times. And it was actually used to measure things. It's a unit of measurement. So this vara, they were the people who controlled tribute, and they were the links between the colonial administration and the indigenous societies, the towns and cultures there. And here's another picture where you can clearly see the two cultures side by side. Here we have a young woman in marabou feathers in probably 1890, 1910, somewhere, probably closer to 1910. And she's ready to go on the grand tour with perhaps a Kodak camera and a tripod. And there were people that made enough money in Cusco to send their kids to college in Europe, to be educated in Europe. And it was, of course, a mark of great status to be able to go to Europe, where your clothes came from, you know, where your fashions came from, where your ideas came from. And they lived side by side with people like this, who is a young woman from a small town south of Cusco called Tinta. And this is her traditional finery. And she's wearing tupus, which go back to the Incas as well. This holds the manta together, and it's a giant sort of silver pin. And this is a very elaborate one. If you look carefully, you can see that it has all these pendants on it. And here she has a little spindle she's weaving, because the Indian women did, in fact, were never idle. They were always doing something. And this is taken by a wonderful photographer who lived in a small, a prosperous but not a large town south of Cusco. And in his work, I think you can really feel this sort of peace and a tranquil kind of communication between the photographer and the subjects that is missing in a lot of the other works. I mean, there's a sort of empathy and just a naturalness in his work it's subtle, but as you look through the pictures, it's there again and again and again. So I will try and keep this talk to a reasonable length, and it's going to be hard. Here, this wall is something we can talk a little bit about. This is an important period in Peruvian history where there was a political, a cultural movement, an artistic movement that was involved in reimagining or repositioning, shall we say, the indigenous culture as a part of authentic, meaningful identity. And you know, they were creating a new national identity that brought in these groups that had previously been essentially overlooked or frankly just exploited and ignored. And this came on the heels of movements, for example, in Mexico, that you see people like Diego Rivera and Covarrubias, and I mean, it had its echoes in other countries. But it was part of a creation of a new national identity. And this happened in Europe too, where, for example, I'm thinking of many famous European composers who went back and suddenly started looking at folk music, like Bartok or somebody. And he was going out and recording, on these old folk tunes. And they were, sort of unearthing and rediscovering their own culture. And this project went on. Cusco was the perfect place for this because it was the ancient seat of the Inca Empire. And it was surrounded by the vestiges of, that you couldn't ignore these monuments. I mean, they're, mind-boggling. But they had been ignored. And so these intellectuals and political figures, and to some extent the government as well, because they began to see that it was essential to get the Indians involved and make them, if Peru was going to progress, they had to find ways to bring the Indians into the modern world, so to speak, and get them to participate meaningfully in the economy. And they began to realize, well, it might be a good idea to educate Indians. Maybe it would be a good idea to give them better health and more political rights. And this did happen. Of course, with more political rights and the ability to raise a stink when people stole their lands, which happened regularly, that triggered a series of rebellions in the countryside, which were going on very much in this period from 1910 to about 1930. And so there was this push and pull between a progressive side that wanted to bring these people into, the Peruvian state, the Peruvian national mind or whatever, bring them in, and those who realized that, well, we still need slaves, and they were serfs. I mean, they were barely sharecroppers in a lot of places, and they had a feudal system. And this was common throughout Spanish colonial America, the latifundios. And in the rural areas of Peru, the people who had the power, who were, of course, worked shoulder to shoulder with the church and the military, were the great landowners. And so you'll see some of these pictures, but here we have photographers capturing this. In these pictures, you see this sudden interest in pre-Columbian culture. Now, this woman is not Indian or indigenous. She is a mestiza, but she's dressed I mean, you can even say it's a little bit like blackface or something, because she's not really an Indian, but she's acting as an Indian in this photograph. And this is probably somebody who's dressed for a theater piece. There was a famous play that had not been performed. In fact, it was banned in 1750 after some big Indian revolts. But it was an Inca play, an opera in a way, called ENTRE. And that play was brought back just in this period, and a group of artists from Cusco, actors, traveled to La Paz and Buenos Aires and Montevideo and presented this play, and it was a huge success. So some of that, again, when we finally come back to Figueroa Aznar, he was an actor, a thespian, and a painter, and a photographer. But this is probably one of the actors that was in this troupe. And these are a series of pictures of some of the prominent ruins. Obviously, Machu Picchu. This was Sacsayhuaman before tourists, which is the great fortress that's above the city of Cusco. Another Inca fortress that's further down the valley towards Machu Picchu. And these pictures are early. These are probably 1905. And the photographer is Gismondi, again, the same one that we have over here. And he took a real interest in ruins, and he was adventurous. I mean, it was hard to get to these places. It was not an easy, you couldn't just hop in a taxi and drive over there. You know, it was a project. You would go by horseback or by mule to get there to see these things. And so he would be with a local official, probably maybe a landowner. And here you have a guy wearing a suit. Well, you had to climb up this mountain to get there. But he's tired, and so he's resting his hand on this kid's head, which is, shall we say, a condescending gesture. And one of the things that's wonderful is that this is the only picture that I've come across. We knew that these images were used for postcards, but this is the first time that we found a negative to go with a postcard. So, and again, this is the same photographer. That's him there, as far as I know. And this is kind of almost like Peruvian Manifest Destiny or something, but you see this, we're planting the Peruvian flag on these pre-Columbian tombs in the middle of the Altiplano near Lake Titicaca. And, you know, there's a sense of pride. There's also a sense of, you know, hey, we've conquered this. You know, this is ours now. I mean, it's not quite like the Old West, but you get this sense of dominion, I think, out of these pictures, which says something about the society. And this is the festival, which is held every year. It's the Solstice Festival, and it's Inti Raimi. It's the end of the winter in the highlands. And what's great about this picture, it may be the first time they really did it up big, but it's a big theater piece. It's very spectacular. And now it's just this crowded, but it's all tourists. And Cusco now sees 4 million tourists a year, so it's not the place that it was when it was 25,000 people back in the day. Now, the thing to bear in mind is when we went through these collections, upwards of 90% of the images you see are portraits, because that was the bread and butter of any studio, was portraiture. And again, of those 90% of them are not that interesting. It's just somebody's great-great-great-grandfather. But there are, you know, if you look, there's tremendous, it's sort of like mining. You know, you go through a ton of ore and then you get a little bit of gold. But some of the photographers were really gifted, and there's some wonderful pictures of family life and things that you would never imagine you would see, like these kids dressed up in 18th century costumes for, you know, some sort of a grand ball, maybe for carnival. Obviously, they belong to the moneyed classes. Family portrait here. This is actually the ship that used to go up and down the coast, which was one of the major ways that you could get from Lima to cities like Arequipa and finally Cusco, because getting to southern Peru from Lima was almost impossible. I mean, you could take a horse, but it would take you forever. So this was a ship. But when you look at these portraits, you say, well, that's funny. It's great that the dog is there, and it's a lovely picture. But what do you miss? Mother's not there. And so there's a lot of loss. There's, you know, in some of these pictures, it's not just what's there, it's what's not there. And this one is pretty spectacular. This is a wet nurse. And in Lima, there's a lot of pictures. Well, I've seen a really nice set of pictures of wet nurses. There, they were primarily black women. But this is surely a campesina, a mestiza. And it was the practice to cover up the wet nurse who's holding the baby steady. Because, of course, she wasn't part of the family, right? But, and again, you know, it's possible that the wet nurse was needed because, you know, women did die in childbirth pretty frequently. So, you know, it served a function. But again, this just speaks to the sort of the racist reality that existed in those days, and still does to some extent. All these are self-explanatory. There are a lot of, there's some really powerful, there's 3 or 4 more pictures from Cusco that didn't get picked here, but that are really fantastic pictures like this of a Memento Mori. And this is, I mean, this is it's a genre of photography that you see in the 19th century. A lot of times people died before they could have their pictures taken. And so if worse came to worse, you'd get a picture taken to remember your children. But it's really like a pietà or something, I think. A wonderful couple here. Something you see in other pictures, they're well-to-do. I mean, she's very well dressed in this satin skirt and fantastic faces. But again, he's prosperous, clearly. I mean, he's got a watch fob and he's dressed in a frock coat and top hat. And this is 1890s, I'm sure. But again, you've got the adobe wall. This may have been taken outside. They may have tacked a backdrop onto the wall and done it in the patio. I mean, that's probably an exterior wall rather than the interior wall of their house, but which would have been plastered. But again, the man will be wearing the more contemporary European outfit, and the women will be wearing more traditional clothes. And it is something that you still see today. This one I just can't resist. I mean, if you study art history, you know about isocephaly. Like, how do you organize people? Well, let's put it in a little line, just like that, you know. But with these lovely hats, and well, there's really nothing to say. It's terrific. And speaking of hats, this is a really interesting picture. Again, I'm going to speculate here. These women are not from Cusco. They're further south. This kind of a hat is closer to what you would see in the highlands around Lake Titicaca and in Bolivia, as opposed to the woman that we saw at the front, who has this big sort of giant pancake headdress, right? And so these women, would be townsfolk. They're not really dressed as, they don't work in the fields. You know, they're people that have a small business of some sort, just you can tell by the way they're dressed. But the fact that everybody has a different kind of a hat, and they're really rather stylishly dressed, especially this young man here with his bow tie and looking very dapper. And then you have this little dummy there, which is like a hat form or whatever you want to call it. I remember the first time I went up to Puno, which is on the shore of Lake Titicaca, and in one of the stores, there was one of these heads. It was in a pharmacy or something. I thought, man, I want that. But, you know, there was no room in my backpack to carry this head around for another 6 months, so I didn't take it. But anyhow, it's a lovely picture. And it took me a while to notice this guy, but when I started looking, and this guy could be in a Sam Peckinpah movie, I think, easily. You know, The Wild Bunch or something. Again, this is from that fellow who lived in the town in the country. A lovely view of a prosperous landowner and his fields. And again, the wife is dressed in traditional, much more traditionally, although obviously very prosperous. She's got a very nice jacket there. And then the daughter, she's dressed in more Western outfits. And so the next generation will be more Westernized. But, you know, with that older generation will have this split. But again, these people were connected by railroad to La Paz, to the sea at Arequipa, and through that to Buenos Aires. And they would get magazines from Europe, and they would get, records and things like that. I mean, when we worked on Arequipa, the photographers that we worked with had a studio where they, in their downstairs studio, they sold magazines from Europe, and they were the local distributors for Decca Records. So if you wanted the latest Louis Armstrong record for, your Victrola, they had it. So it's not, the reality is more complicated than you think. They seem like they lived at the end of the world, but it was a time when things didn't move as fast as they move now. So if you were getting the news from Europe in terms of fashion or music or whatever, and it was 6 months old, so what? I mean, it was still news to you, right? So, but it was an area, again, we see the society in transition. And this is probably, I would guess, from the 30s, maybe even the early 40s, just guess by the way they're dressed. And we don't have dates, unfortunately, on most of these. It's impossible to tell what they would be. This is an interesting document. President Ernesto Leguía, in order to expand the railroads and, sanitary systems, drainage, and roads, rammed through a law that conscripted campesinos and peasants to build the roads. So they had to give a certain amount of time every weekend. They would go and work for 2 days on the roads. Well, this was obviously not popular with the people who had to go. It was not unlike the system that the Incas used too. I mean, you gave a couple of months of a year of work to the Inca state to do whatever, build a palace or build an Inca road, for example. And so here we have payday for this group of people. And of course, you have to have the church, so there's the church. And I don't see any military guys here. That's a little odd. There's usually somebody. But anyway, when you look at this picture, when you look at the scan, and these are big negatives, and we scan them at very high resolution, so you can zoom in and see pretty much anything you want. The amount of money on that table is tiny for all those people. I mean, it's 2 or 3 stacks of bills for all these people. So you can tell that nobody was getting rich. Some people, however, were getting rich. This guy was rich. And he's part of the latifundio system. He's dressed, by the way he's dressed, this is what the wealthy landowners wore. And he's there with his assistant, maybe his son, who knows. But this guy, that expression tells you everything. I mean, it's astonishing, I think. I mean, and he was obviously nobody you want to mess with. He would have liked Roy Cohn, I'm pretty sure. Would have been a good cabinet member. And again, this is an early picture from about 1911, but one of the things that was happening, and I'll pick this up over here because we'll see something else, but one of the interesting things that happened in the teens, 20s, and was that other sports and other sort of activities, recreational activities, were introduced to Peru. And traditionally, there would have been religious fiestas, bullfights, and cockfights, and that was it. But they introduced sports like basketball and tennis, and all sorts of, the things that we all think of as normal sports today had not existed before then. And so when you think of cultural change, you always think of culture as, books and ideas and music and art, but it's also sports, and that was transitioning as well. This one I love a lot too. If this man's not a psychopath, I've never seen one. But this photographer worked for, among other things, he worked for the police. And I don't know for sure, but this sort of pose was used for Army recruits. But these guys just don't look like anybody you'd want to have in the Army. But I'm just saying, I think that they were probably, it's a lineup, or they were suspects, if we will. This is a Chambi, which the museum here owns, a very famous image. And again, you have an indigenous man, really, who he is now an instrument of the Western state, if you will, or the colonial state, and, keeping his fellow campesinos down. And although when you go to the markets in Peru, you do have to be careful of the little kids. They're still pretty good at it. This one is really wonderful. This is another Chambi. And this guy was a well-known figure in Cusco. He earned his living hauling big loads around. He was called a cargador. And so it occurred to Chambi, or maybe to his assistant here in Mendivil, that it would make a great picture. And this is in a tradition of, I mean, there are plenty of pictures of, you know, dwarves and giants, and, you know, there was Barnum and Bailey, and, you know, these sorts of pictures have, there's sort of a, you know, a genre of these too. But this one, you know, it's just so pregnant with other readings, if you will. I mean, he's dressed so wonderfully, again, in a Western outfit. He's wearing the most threadbare clothing imaginable, but he's so peaceful and so relaxed about it, and obviously happy to be there. But this was at a time, it wasn't until 1940 that they did a really serious census in Peru. And it was assumed at the time that this picture was taken that Peru was something like 80% campesino, or indigenous. And so this was a source of concern, if you will, with the, you know, with the mestizo and criollo ruling classes on the coast and in other places, because there's a sense of this giant mass of people. What do we do with them? You know, it's not unlike another preoccupation our president has about brown people. And so it wasn't until 1940 that they did a census, and they realized that it was really about 45% mestizo, or you know, to some blend of European and indigenous, and 45% campesino, or more purely indigenous. So it was really almost an even blend, but people, that was not their perception. And one of the things that was happening was that actually the country was becoming a mestizo country, just like the US is in a lot of ways. And I think here we have an emblematic image that shows you what it means, you know, I mean, I see this almost as that sort of criollo, mestizo class pondering, like, what do we do with this giant mass of people, right, who are bigger than we are, more numerous than we are. So it's again, I'm reading a lot into this, but I studied art history, and it's okay, you can do that. This is Chambi in his studio. His daughter Julia is one of these two ladies here. And again, this shows you the photographer at work, earning his daily bread. They would blow these up. They were, the negatives and also the photos themselves were heavily retouched, especially portraiture. And this is the studio. It's a lousy negative, and it's a crummy print. Not my print, by the way. But the studio would have had huge expanses of glass, windows, and then they had, it's a little hard to tell, but they have these curtains that run across, and above, the glass probably went up over the roof, at least on one side. So they had plenty of light to take the pictures. But if they needed to control where the light fell, they used these curtains, because they didn't have what modern photographers have now, umbrellas and all these stands and all this sort of stuff that you use. In the background is one of his backdrops there. But he's very proud of himself. I mean, one of the things about Chambi and Figueroa, for example, is you get a very strong sense that they were protagonists, that they saw themselves, they have an image of themselves as figures who were important, and they had a sense of themselves as actors in a way. I mean, he's acting. And Chambi does this a lot. When you look at these postcards over here, you will see him doing the same thing. You know, in this picture, he's wearing, you know, he's wearing a waistcoat and Western clothing. But he goes to Machu Picchu, and he brings along a very fancy poncho. So he can photograph himself sitting in the window of one of the palaces in Machu Picchu, dressed as an Indian, a campesino, right? As an indígena. But that picture right there, taken on the same trip, shows him in what he would have been wearing, which is jodhpurs and a jacket and a Western, nice Homburg there. And he's got, you can't see it there, but he's carrying some binoculars. And he's standing on the most sacred spot in Machu Picchu, which is the Intihuatana, which was they call it the hitching post of the sun. But it's where they would do a ritual at the when the sun at the solstice, when it moves to its final extent, they mark it with the Intihuatana, and then the sun starts moving back. But I mean, it was crucial to tracking the seasons and planting and everything else, and it was a huge religious moment. And these very few of these Intihuatanas, I think maybe 2, are left because the Spanish destroyed them all. But there you have him in 2 different poses. You know, he's the Westerner, and he's also, you know, the torchbearer for his indigenous culture. And one of the things very quickly, Chambi was, he loved he never lost, touch with his roots. He loved his people, and he traveled extensively. I mean, he wasn't afraid to get on a mule and go way, way back into the mountains. And he photographed all the rituals, all the common costumes, and harvesting, musical figures that are still around today in some cases. And he was very gifted, but he realized that these things were also a good way to make money. And, you know, postcards were a big part of his income. And you can still get these on eBay if you look hard enough. Let's see, how are we doing? Well, not too bad. Okay, again, these are the more modern. We're moving into the more modern times in 30s and 40s. This is Crisanto Cabrera, by and large, who has never had a studio, but he's a really interesting character. And he's got a lot of humor in what he does. Some of it's very deadpan, but I like him a lot. And there's not that much of his work left, but what there is pretty strong. This is a figure that, one of his photos, done in a bordello. And in the scans that we've done, there are several more pictures of a woman that I'm almost certain is this woman. And she's wearing clothes. And I think that she may have been his girlfriend or at least paramour of some sort. But again, this gets to another theme of the show, which is one of the things that's interesting about this collection of images and these photographers is that there are a lot of interesting images of women and a lot of different views of what you see people trying on new roles. In particular, I mean, Maida and I spent some time yesterday talking about this, but, you know, gender roles and, you know, non-traditional sexuality. I mean, you see women who are posing with other women in a way that tells you that they're not just friends. And, you know, in a way, photography provided sort of a small private theater for them to be who they were in a way that would have been extremely sanctioned in very traditional society. And, you know, I have some pictures from some of the other collections there actually some of the material in Cusco has 2 men dressed as Indian women in traditional costume who are obviously good friends. And it's, you know, things like that. You start looking at this and you realize, you know, they're telling lots and lots of stories here. And it's a complicated story, and it's not the simpler version that you might think. And I mean, even today, if you go to Peru, it's very rare to see anybody who's openly gay. It's, you know, it's still a much more closeted sort of society than what we see today in, you know, the United States. And again, this gets to the sports thing. I'm not sure, I can't swear what this is, but the fact that this woman has a rolled up piece of paper in her hand, I'm thinking that she is somehow involved in bringing tennis to Cusco. And maybe she has plans for a tennis court. I mean, she's obviously from the wealthy classes, and so are they. But these 3 ladies are dressed in tennis clothing. And the picture has a meaning. It's not just accidentally that we found all these people here and they happen to be playing tennis in the middle of this forest. And, I mean, it's planted, of course. And it's non-indigenous trees. It's eucalyptus, which grows well there, but is not indigenous. But in any case, it's interesting to see, again, in modern academic terms, women with agency, you know, who are, again, they're taking an active part in their lives and not just being sort of a subset of their husband and, you know, having a traditional woman's role as a mother and a wife. So it's to see this sort of, pretty progressive attitude in this, what I think most people would assume was a very isolated and traditional culture, is, eye-opening for me. Some more pictures by Cabrera here. This is Chambi. These are pretty self-expressive, but this genre of pictures commemorating celebrations, usually involving a great deal of beer, is very common, and there are lots of these. In La Paz, where there was even more beer, we have some spectacular pictures of this sort of stuff, and even the kids are drunk, which is pretty fabulous. But again, just to show you the range of figures that you would have found, and people dressed in absolutely to the nines. I mean, they would have looked fine in any street in London or Paris wearing those outfits. This is a wonderful picture of one of the early public schools. It was at one point finally, as part of the indigenista, not movement exactly, but the realization on the part of the government that they had to do something, and that they needed an educated workforce. Public school became free, and they began building public schools in the countryside. So this would have been a brand new school. And one of the wonderful things about scanning these pictures is when I'm retouching the image, and yes, these are retouched, this is not the way they look right out of the scanner. I go back and I go through these things millimeter by millimeter practically. And looking back in here, I realized all the kids in back have no shoes. The kids in front do. So they're literally putting their best foot forward. And again, this is probably from the 40s, a lovely image that if I were doing this show sort of sequentially, I would have made this the end, because my original thought for sequencing the pictures was to start with babies, but from the old photographs, and then move through the different phases of life in society, and then come back to the children, because of course they're the future again, coming in the next generation. But this is, ¿cómo se llama esa fiesta? La de, La de, ya sé, it starts with a V. I can't think. Anyhow, this is a particular festival where they take corn stalks and they decorate large crosses. And it'll come to me, but anyway, it's clearly one special fiesta that they're doing. Oh, we're getting there, okay. And again, more pictures that show you sort of the variety of roles that were opening up for women. For quite a while, I thought this was a man and a woman, and then I realized that the man had pierced ears. So it made me think that it was a different story. Now, Adelma says that, they might have been acting in a play. I don't think so, but again, you can make your own decision on that. And I'm not really sure why dogs feature so much in these pictures. You would think they would keep them out of the photo, but apparently it doesn't really, nobody cared. And we have another, it's not the same dog, by the way, and it's not the same photographer, but again, and maybe the dog was the only person who would put up with him, but who knows. And this is, from the costume, you can tell that the Peruvian military was influenced by the French military, because that's a French military uniform, essentially, same style. However, in Bolivia, they're wearing these sort of World War I Kaiser helmets, which are pretty, so that the Bolivians had the German model, and the French, and neither one of them were very good at fighting wars, actually, when it came right down to it. But. And again, another interesting photo, also by Ochoa, this photographer I like, who has that sort of rapport with his, with his subjects that is fairly rare. And again, just a lovely photo of a woman wearing basically man's dress. And I think it's a fairly daring statement, really. I mean, she's making a point in some way, at least that she's a modern woman, if nothing else. And maybe she'd been seeing Marlene Dietrich movies. I mean, you have to realize also that movies were were suddenly becoming available. So all sorts of, stories and roles and ideas were coming into these isolated towns through movies. And so they could suddenly participate in 20th century culture. Well, and here we are for the postre on the show. But this is Juan Manuel Figueroa Aznar, who is a fantastic figure in his own right and a very good photographer. Perhaps a better photographer than he is a painter, but I won't. I'll let Anibal decide whether he can. I'll go by his judgment. But he was, as I said, he was again. This is from that play that I was talking about, Ollantay, and it's a little bit like Aida. It's the story of a young Inca princess, Añusta, who falls in love with the Inca's general, I believe is the story. And of course it's a forbidden love, and it doesn't turn out well. But this was the play, and of course they're dressed to the nines in these sort of not quite deco imaginings of what the Inca wore. But I mean, this is very traditional. That is what a princess would have worn, something similar to that. This is an authentic campesino, an Indian from a town called Quero, and posed here in the studio, obviously enjoying himself. And he has one of the things that you notice if you're around people Indians who really work, their feet are, I mean, they walk barefoot everywhere, and so their feet do not look like our feet. It's one of the ways you can tell whether they're dressing up as an Indian or they're really an Indian. And, but I'm not sure, but I swear that this picture is somehow influenced by Afternoon of a Faun, which was a big scandal with a famous ballet that Nijinsky did. And somebody at Figueroa's level would have been quite familiar with this. I mean, they would have read about this, sort of scandalous ballet performance. And Nijinsky was, of course, a famous figure in those days. And there are pictures of him from Afternoon of a Faun that remind me very much of this. And I can't help but think that it might have inspired him to do this. It's a little bit of a play with that, that particular piece of ballet. He loved his stage stuff, and for all I know, these guys really are doctors. They are not going to operate on this guy, I don't think. But you've got the ether; he's etherized, we hope. And one of the things that struck me about this picture is that I can swear that these two guys are twins, and he's a brother or something. I mean, I think there's something special about these three guys. And again, that's something that you come to realize when you stare at this thing for an hour while you're retouching it. These things come into your head. I'm going to let Anibal speak here because he knows more about this room than anybody in this room. So come on up, Doctor. It's really a pleasure.
Well, really, for me, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here. This came all of a sudden. It happened that last week we were visiting our daughter who works in Portland. And for some reason, somebody told us, oh, by the way, there are going to be a photo exhibit in Jean, and it's something about our grandfather, Papa Manuel Figueroa. So here we are. So this is really for us a great treat. And for me, seeing all those pictures that I am so familiar with my grandfather. As a matter of fact, when I met my grandfather, I was probably, I remember, 6 or 7 years old. And at that time, he was not a photographer any longer. He was a painter. And my grandfather became really very well known and very famous painter in Cusco and all Peru as a painter, as an oil painter, and not as a photographer. The photographer thing came later on when they discovered that. Because then I know situations that they were really very interesting. The relationship of my grandfather, Manuel Figueroa, and Chambi. Chambi used to work for my grandfather in his studio. And my grandfather noticed that he was a very capable fellow, you know. And it was that conjunction of what Peter said about the hybrid Peru. Chambi was really a pure Indian, and my grandfather was pure Spanish. So that was the junction of both arts. And then when my grandfather decided to quit photography, he left all his studio to Chambi. And Chambi took over that, and then he became very, very famous photographer. So it's an incredible relationship that I can make with that, and I'm so happy to share with you. Peter asked me if I can tell some anecdote about my grandfather, and I'll be very happy to do it. To begin with, I can tell you that I was the first grandson of my grandfather, of the Figueroa Yabar family, and I grew up playing in this wonderful salon, el Salón Dorado or Salón Azul. And my great-great-granduncle was the Bishop of Cusco, Monseñor Benigno Yabar. So that was the Casa de los Yabar. And my grandfather was a young artist from the northern part of Peru, that he came to Cusco, hired by the Catholic Church to restore all the art in the churches of Cusco. They discovered at that time the Cusqueña, the Peruvian School of Painting. So my grandfather came to do all the work on that. And at that time, when he was doing that, he saw a family, a very well-known family in Cusco, coming to the church for Mass. And he got a crush with this beautiful lady in that family. And well, at the end of his working for the church, he said, I would like to paint something for the church. And he did, of course. So he was commissioned to paint a virgin, the Immaculate Conception. So there is a beautiful Immaculate Conception with the face of the niece of the Bishop of Cusco. So apparently it was some kind of a uproar about that. And so the church, they felt that it cannot put that picture in the church. So that's given away to a nuns, to a cloister nuns, the nuns of Santa Catalina or something like that. So the family, we knew that there was a picture there, but nobody saw it. But about maybe 20 or 30 years ago, they changed the rules, and they opened all those cloisters. So then we were able to see the picture of the Immaculate Conception with the face of Mama Ovita, our grandmother. So the family approached the church and said, don't you think that you can give it to us for the family, that picture? And apparently they have all kind of meetings, and they said that no, that was not possible. But 2 months later, the family came back and said, how about if we do a little donation to the church and we can have it? And so we did. So now that picture is in Cusco in one of our families. Well, well, my mother was the oldest of 14. So that was the reason that I was the first son, or the first grandson, and practically 2 or 3 years younger than my younger daughters, my younger mother's sisters. So this is the story, and how happy I am here to share with you and to see my grandfather here. And of course, now with our new technology, Peru is waiting for me for my WhatsApp to send all these pictures of you wonderful guys here. So that's been really wonderful, and thank you very much for having us. And Peter and Cheryl, they've been so wonderful, so gracious with us. Thank you very much.
I guess, sure, if you want. I mean, Stick around, well, in case anybody has. He does have pictures of himself as a young man in that room. He has documentary proof that he was there. So, but yeah, it's amazing. And he just pointed out something that I had not seen. This picture is, you can see a blow of it over there on that screen. You have to tap out on it. You have to have that special touch to make it work, but it does work. But what I thought were separate pictures of these young women, and although there are individual pictures of young women, this is actually wallpaper that he says came from Brussels. But again, it's very odd to see the bishop's grand reception salon covered with pictures of young women. I mean, I don't know. And some of them are dressed, shall we say, not for church. But it is, I mean, I can't even imagine what this room, it must have been overwhelming, literally, to walk in there. And this carpet was blue, which is one reason it's called the Salon Azul. But one thing that we didn't touch on too much, Dr. Pepper did bring it, yes, that's his name, did bring up the fact that Chambi worked with Figueroa and he inherited his studio. And one thing to understand about, it's a subtext of this show, but for a long time, the only person anybody had ever heard of was Martín Chambi. And the family was pretty much keen to keep it that way. But he was, and like all artists and artistic movements, there's a series of people, they build on each other. Just like, Leonardo studied with Ghirlandaio. He just didn't go out and become Leonardo. I mean, they're all trained, photographers especially. And so these photographers knew each other. Sometimes when they went out of business, they bought each other's studios. They were trained by each other. Sometimes they got tired of a backdrop and gave it away to somebody else. And there were a lot of very talented photographers in Cusco, and Chambi was one. And he had a special gift, and a special because of who he was, because he was raised in a little tiny village in a very hard scrabble part of the mountains near Lake Titicaca. And then, he became, this amazing sort of international figure. And, it's a fantastic story, and it's one reason that he's so famous. It's because he's got a great story. But it shouldn't obscure the fact that there were lots of other talented photographers who had a different point of view and different access to society. And so it's one of the things I'm very happy to be able to do is to add a much larger context to all this work. But please, any questions? I know you all have better places to go, but nobody? Yeah. Oh, no. Well, yeah, there were family collections. The CBC, the Fototeca Andina, was brought together from family collections and purchased. That material was brought together into, it's part of an Andean Studies Center in Cusco. And so that material was brought together by two American anthropologists, Deborah Poole and Fran Antman, who worked after Ed Rani sort of rediscovered the Chambi studio. They were working in anthropology in the Cusco area, but they realized that this material could be really useful from an anthropological point of view, and they also understood that, well, where there's one photographer, there's probably more. And so they started trying to figure out who was who and who had done what, and they got a Ford Foundation grant to create the Fototeca Andina. And my compañera, my right-hand man, Adelma Benavente, was trained as an anthropologist, and she had been working with Debbie and Fran. And so when they created this Fototeca, the director of Bartolomé de las Casas, that's where the Fototeca is, said, Adelma, you're going to run this. And, and she said, me? I mean, she was a young woman, relatively in her 20s, and she said, I don't know anything about photography. She says, well, you'll learn. So, but she was meeting her was one of the key things in getting all this, making this possible. But it's a real split. Very little of it is held in museums, and Fototeca is really the only sort of institution like that we've dealt with. But all in all, over the course of the 3 years, we worked with 11 different archives, and most of them were family archives. So it was a really interesting project. It was very hard work sometimes, but you know, looking back on it, I still kind of get choked up about it because it was such a privilege. We just lucked out to be able to do this. You know, we killed ourselves to do it, but you know, I just thought, how often do you get to find all this stuff? You don't. And some of it is so incredibly fascinating. So I feel very lucky. Yeah. And of course you get to meet wonderful people along the way.
This picture really was not in the bishop's house. That was the home of the Yavar family. So, and the bishop was part of one of the brothers, Yavar. So he didn't really start the room. That was the room of the Yavar family, in the Yavar family home, not in the bishop. Yes. And then, as you know, as I mentioned, that he became a painter, and he painted in Cusco, in the cathedral, there are all the paintings of all the bishops, and 2 of those bishops are painted by Figueroa. And I think one of that picture is that's also that's hanging in the cathedral in Cusco. That picture. Yes.
At least I got that.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Yeah.
So I was in Cusco, and I was told that Cusco was like an art center where so many artists had moved to Cusco to paint, and the only way to evangelize to the indigenous people or the Mayans was to paint all these, you know, crucifixion or the Last Supper or whatever. And so was your grandfather sort of part of this sort of?
Well, I think you are better qualified to answer that.
I suspect that you're probably thinking of older painting, because there is a Last Supper in Cusco, which is famous because they're eating cuy, which is guinea pig, right? So this is much later. But Cusco is, of course, was a cultural center, and it was, as I said, it was naturally the hub of this indigenista movement, at least the cultural side. And it's still a hotbed for painters, and, you know, I mean, it's awfully picturesque. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Anywhere from about 9 by 7. A little bit of the material from La Paz is actually 9 by 12. I have an amazing picture of the day, it's the port of Arica, the day that they signed the final peace treaty in the War of the Pacific between Peru and Chile. And they didn't sign this until years and years after the war ended, but they finally got around to signing it, kind of like North Korea and South Korea, when they're still working on it. But the Chilean Navy is out, and you can see it in the bay there. But this was a 9 by 12 negative. And I mean, you can figure out, you can see, you know, there's all these machine guns and stuff out on this pier, and you can figure out what brand of machine gun it is. It's that the negative is that big and it has that much information. It's incredible. So even the small ones, even a 3 by 5 negative has a lot of information in it. So. One last thing just about negatives. I really think that the material from this period, when acetate negatives, what we think of as flexible negatives, came into vogue. A lot of, especially after the Depression, which hit really hard in 1930, all this kind of culture vanished in a lot of ways because the wealthy families that had subsidized some of these artist photographers, they fell on hard times. Pretty soon, everybody could afford to have a small camera, and they would set up a little shop taking ID photos. And it just kind of, it all got dumbed down. And it just, from the 40s on, there's really, I mean, to my mind anyway, I don't find anything that's nearly as fascinating as this. But, you know, the era of glass is the best era, I think. So, well, thank you all very much for putting up with this.
Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the exhibition. We'll have another lecture by Jorge Coronado, who's a professor at Northwestern University and recently wrote a book on portraits in the Andes, and that'll be in April. So pick up one of our calendars or members magazines downstairs, and we have the list of the dates and times of the lectures related to the show. Thank you.